Okay, I'm hitting it now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever state you're in, and welcome to the January 2021 ENSO seminar. So it is very nice to be getting back into things as we get started in putting 2020 behind us and moving on to a brighter and much more positive 2021 ahead, we hope. It's not started off that way, of course, but nevertheless, Manuel is going to single-handedly change the tone of how things have got off to a start. So I am very pleased to have Manuel Heras Escribano here to give our January talk, looking into a topic that is dear to my heart, as we can plug without shame, Manuel, the special issue of the research topic in Frontiers that we edited on this topic just last year with Ezequiel De Paulo and Tony Chimero, looking at ecological psychology, or the relationship between ecological psychology and enaction. So I'm going to give our live audience just a little bit of time to catch up to speed. And in the meantime, actually, Manuel, you've had a sort of a fascinating background. You've got experience in the University of the Basque Country, in Chile, in Japan, and so you've explored a lot of the sort of approaches, or the wealth of kind of different accents, as it were, of inaction that exist out there. So you need to sort of get yourself dug into some predictive processing and whatever else to sort of properly round things out. And but you're currently based in the University of Granada, is that right?
Yeah, in the University of Granada, with the PhiloLab Unit of Excellence, which is in the Department of Philosophy 1. Excellent. Where I got my PhD, so I am back home.
Very good. And we are, and you as well, I think it probably useful to know, just as we're letting people to catch up to speed, or to properly catch online. We have possibly one or two other people who might join us live as well. We'll see how that goes. But I wanted to, you mentioned just before we went live that you just finished editing another special issue, which has been a long time in the making. Can you give me the journal of that one again?
Well, the special issue I edited with Lorena Lobo is for a journal of the University of Tarapacá in Chile. The journal is called Límite, which is an interdisciplinary journal of psychology and philosophy. And the special issue is it's entitled, if I remember properly, Technology and Cognition, a Fori Perspective. And it features 6 papers from either young researchers or well-known researchers in the area on different aspects of Fori cognition and technology. For example, Robert Cloves from Universidade Nova de Lisboa wrote a paper on identity in the internet. Gloria Andrada, who got recently her PhD from the at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Now she will move to Berkeley soon. Wrote a paper on transparency and epistemic aspects of extended cognition. Also, Jesus Vega from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid on affordances and task escapes. So there are some papers that all those papers are really nice, and I think the special issue is going to be it's going to be something that everyone who likes either Fori cognition or the philosophy of technology would really appreciate, because I think it touches every little area of the philosophy of technology from a Fourier perspective. So I think it's a good combination.
Sounds awesome. Okay. So I think we have a good few people, maybe 19 or 20 watching live. We have a couple of people who have joined us live, and we'll hopefully have a nice, fruitful discussion later on. So without further ado, Manuel, I invite you to share your screen, and we can launch into the January 2021 ENSO seminar on ecological psychology and enaction, convergences and divergences.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. Can you see it?
Yep, all looking good.
Nice. So thanks, Mark, for inviting me to this ENSO seminar series. It's great to be here, finally. The title of my talk is Ecological Psychology and Enaction, Convergence or Divergence. And the main aim of this talk is to offer a general view of the main points of convergence and divergence of ecological psychology and enaction, with the aim of answering another further question. How should we proceed to build a 4E, a post-cognitivist or a non-cognitivist approach to the mind and the cognitive sciences? So those who know me well know that I will conclude by claiming that, as I see it, ecological psychology is in a better position for building that non-cognitivist approach to cognitive sciences we all want in the 4E world. So my talk will proceed as follows. First, I will introduce the main ideas of ecological psychology and enaction. Then I will try to highlight the convergences and complementarities. And for that, there are many options, but I will focus on my own proposal. And after that, I will highlight some divergences stressed by authors such as Varela, Harry Heft, or Ezequiel Di Paolo. And then I will evaluate Gallagher's proposal for understanding enaction as a philosophy of nature rather than a research program. That proposal was written in his book, Enactivist Interventions. And finally, I will claim that ecological psychology is both a philosophy of nature and a research program, which will lead me to conclude that this leaves ecological psychology in a better position to lead or to offer a new cognitive science that is fully embodied, situated, and non-representational. So first I will introduce enaction. We are all familiar with it, so I will try to be quick. As you all know, it's not a single approach, but a constellation of approaches to cognition and life that share some common points. It was proposed as such in the 90s. It was inaugurated with the book The Embodied Mind by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, which is a classic. It was offered as a main alternative to cognitivism and its main ideas, such as representationalism or computationalism. So it can be defined as Thompson does in a negative way, claiming that the enactive approach is based on the thesis that basic cognition is not mediated or constituted by internal semantic representations. But there's a positive story of it, there's a positive definition of enaction, which is based on the idea that cognition is grounded on sensorimotor contingencies. That would be like the main point of agreement of all these branches of enaction. So as Varela, Thompson, and Roche defined it, the enactive approach consists of 2 points. First, that perception consists in perceptually guided action. And second, the cognitive structures emerge from the recurrent sensorimotor patterns that enable action to be perceptually guided. So as such, as Di Paolo, Burman, and Barandiaran claimed, perceiving is a form of acting. So the concept of sensorimotor contingency is key, is at the very core of the proposal, and it's a scientific concept that is explained lawfully or scientifically. we shall say that perceivers, as Noe and O'Regan claim, have sensations in a particular sense modality when they exercise their mastery of the sensory motor laws that govern the relation between possible action and the resulting changes in incoming information in that sense modality. So sensation is tied naturally to action, and it's the mastery of these contingencies that lead us to have sensations. So enactivists, based on this idea, gathered data from different methodologies and fields of study, such as artificial life, experimental psychology, or computational modeling, and reinterpreted those data on the basis of their own view of the mind and cognition. This point is very important, and we will come again to this idea of reinterpreting empirical evidence at the end of the talk, in the part in which I will mention Gallagher's understanding of enaction as a philosophy of nature. So, enaction, I said, is a constellation of approaches because we can differentiate at least three varieties or branches. First, the official enactive approach, or the traditional enactive approach, or the classic one, or even it is defined sometimes as autopoietic enactivism. It is the earliest proposal, the earliest in time, and it's a variety that combines a biological explanation of the origins of life that comes from the theory of autopoiesis proposed by Maturana and Varela, with a view on cognition as based on sensorimotor contingencies, which is strongly inspired by Merleau-Pontian phenomenology. So both views strongly emphasize agency and autonomy, understood both biologically and cognitively, and they aim to build a bridge between cognition and the biological basis of cognition. The second variety is sensorimotor enactivism, which leaves aside the biological part to focus more on the sensorimotor part. And the work of authors like Kevin O'Regan and Alba Noa is key for this branch. And finally, radical enactivism is the newest branch, and it is more a methodologically oriented approach that aims to radicalize the current discourse or narratives in for cognition by removing concepts or aspects that could be problematic in as much as they could work as hidden vestiges of representationalism. So a lot of conceptual analysis is involved as well in this part. And the main references are Hatton and Min's ideas. So although they share a general rejection of, all these branches share a general rejection of cognitivism, there are some disputes among these branches. Just to mention just quickly two of them. First of all, Alba Noa advocated explicitly in favor of representationalism to make sense of experience, contrary to the proposal of authors such as Evan Thompson or Ezequiel Di Paolo. And he wrote things like the following: mere sensation, mere stimulation falls short of perceptual awareness. As stated earlier, for perceptual sensation to constitute its experience, that is, for it to have genuine representational content, the perceiver must process and make use of sensorimotor knowledge. So he tied experience to having representational content, which is something that the earliest branch of enactivism would reject. Also, not all authors within traditional enactivism are happy with the proposal of a contentless approach to perception and action offered by radical enactivism. In his review of the latest book of Hatton and Min, Thompson claimed that the enactive approach does not claim that basic cognition is contentless, or that it is not subject to intentional norms that are irreducible to biological norms. And he invoked the idea that there are different approaches to different ways of understanding content beyond non-representational content. So in sum, although generally non-cognitivist, the enactive approach can be divided in different varieties or branches that do not necessarily share the same exact research program or main commitments. This can be understood as something that gives strength to the view, but also that weakens the view. And now let's move to ecological psychology. It is a non-cognitivist approach to perception and action that was born between the 50s and the 70s of the 20th century, which means that it advanced the main ideas of embodiment and situatedness proposed by the Fourier approach in the 90s. So back in the 60s and the 70s, ecological psychology reacted against cognitivism, behaviorism, representationalism, and also computationalism, philosophical functionalism, and as I will show later, information processing. And the main ideas that the ecological approach proposed to as an alternative to these views are based on key concepts such as perception-action continuity, agency, organism-environment mutuality, direct perception and direct perceptual learning, thanks to action and ecological information, which is a concept that is key in the proposal, in the approach. To offer a general view of ecological psychology in a sentence, I'd like to highlight the concept of direct perception, which is, in the word of Harry Heft, can be defined as follows. Direct perception means that perception of the environment, that is, the detection of its relational structure by means of perceptual systems, is not mediated by non-perceptual processes, such as stored memories, mental representations, and the like. As we can see, no cognitivist aspect is involved in this view. In sum, ecological psychology aims to offer a new ontology of the mind and perception, as well as a new scientific framework to offer a naturalist scientific approach to perception. It is important to underline that for ecological psychology, empirical aspects are key, and proof of this is that ecological psychologists have spent more than 50 years collecting data and gathering empirical evidence in a vast corpus with their own models and with their own metrics. And I think this point is important to be emphasized at the very beginning, because we will see how this affects ecological psychology as a strong research program. So to give a more general overview of the approach, ecological psychology starts from the idea that the main unit of analysis of cognition is neither the agent itself nor the environment, but the organism-environment system, which makes it the first fully situated approach in the theoretical market to propose this idea. Agents are explorers, and it is through action that they perceive. So perception is understood as a part of an action-perception loop that is established thanks to the exploration of agents that engage with different environmental aspects, in particular ecological information. This kind of information is the way in which these researchers refer to how energy arrays, for example light, forms pattern in a particular location. When agents explore, they encounter this pattern and make use of it to make their way in the world. This is the detection of ecological information. This allows agents to perceive their environment directly, and there's no need to postulate inner processes of computation for making sense of this. So agents detect ecological information because ecological information is specific. That pattern of energy arrays, for example, a light pattern in a room, corresponds to the way the world is. So agents get directly in touch with the world, perceiving the affordances or possibilities for acting that are available in their environment. So in sum, there are shared assumptions of ecological psychology and enaction. First of all, they emphasize bodily agency, they emphasize action and exploration, and they react against computationalism, information processing, and the philosophical foundations that support all these views of cognitive science, such as Cartesianism. So there have been many attempts to converge EP and enaction, ecological psychology and enaction. As Marek said at the very beginning of the talk, we edited a special issue in Frontiers in Psychology, which is, I think, where we can find the latest attempts to see convergences and complementarities of these two views. But there are many others proposals. Here, I want to focus on my own proposal for combining ecological psychology and enaction that can be found in at least 2 publications of mine in 2019. There, I offered a 2-level approach to make sense of all aspects of cognition, combining ecological psychology and enaction in 2 different levels. Level 1 would be the ecological scale, or the organism environment system as it is understood in ecological psychology and in dynamic nature. And then level 2 could be understood as the organismal or subpersonal level, one focused on the agent, in which enactivists could focus on the sensorimotor contingencies of the agent that support or give rise to what happens at the organism environment system. So I tried to illustrate this with the case of sensory substitution devices, which are devices, for those who are not familiar with this kind of devices, they are devices that substitute one sense by another one. For example, they transform visual information into haptic information for visually impaired people. So I think this make a good illustration of what I want to say. I started from the proposal of Travieso and Jacobs, who are part of the Perception and Movement Research Group at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. They focused on experiments on sensory substitution with their own sensory substitution device called the T-Sight. They focused on tasks like navigation that take into account an ecological perspective on the explanation of that task. For example, from focusing on the organism environment system. And then I claim that those experiments, those settings could be complemented with an analysis of the sensory motor contingencies and the sensory motor patterns involved in the exploration of the navigation task. So these sensory motor contingencies could be analyzed in terms of neurodynamics, and then we could see the different sensory motor patterns that apply for different exploration tasks from an ecological perspective. So this 2-level approach, I thought at the time that it could be really fruitful. But there are also divergences and tensions between enaction and ecological psychology, and I will mention some ideas of 4 main works. First, I will mention some ideas in a wonderful paper which is part of the special issue that Marek and I edited with Tony and Ezequiel. It is authored by Harry Heft, and I think it's one of the best papers you can find on the relation between enaction and ecological psychology. And then I will also take some ideas from the paper of Fultot, Nie, and Carello, published in 2016 in Constructivist Foundations. Also, some ideas from the classic book of Varela, Thompson, and Roche, and also a comment that Ezequiel Di Paolo made to that paper of Fultot, Nie, and Carello on ecological psychology. So, first, divergence or tension. Some enactivists claim that the environment is more important than agency for ecological psychology. As it was claimed by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, we disalign ourselves with this explication because we believe that it leads, this explication is ecological psychology, of course, it leads to a research strategy in which one attempts to build an ecological theory of perception entirely from the side of the environment. And such an attempt neglects not only the structural unity or the autonomy of the animal, but also the co-determination of animal and environment that we have gone to such great lengths to stress. However, as I see it, this is a mischaracterization of ecological psychology. First of all, and as we have seen, ecological psychology departs from the organism-environment mutuality. It is neither the organism nor the environment what is the main unit of analysis, but the intricacy of both of them, the co-determination, the mutuality of both of them. As Gibson claimed, the words animal and environment make an inseparable pair. Each term implies the other. No animal could exist without an environment. Equally, although not so obvious, an environment implies an animal to be surrounded. Also, as Michaels and Palatinus claimed when defined ecological psychology as a contender of cognitivism, the alternative ecological view is organism-environment mutuality. The organism-environment system is taken as the minimal unit of analysis in the behavioral and cognitive sciences, and ought not to be disjointed into separate areas of inquiry. Also, ecological psychology paid special attention to agency. It was considered as a hallmark of psychology by Eleanor Gibson, and two key aspects of agency for Eleanor Gibson should be retrospectivity and prospectivity, for example. But Edward Reed, even claimed that the goal of ecological psychology was to explain agency scientifically. This is empirically, not merely offering a discourse about it. That is why he proposed the idea of action systems as based on James Gibson's idea of perceptual systems to complement all the agential part in that, although there's a lot of it in the original proposal by Gibson. So this means, in ecological terms, to understand agency as part of the organism-environment system and not an isolated phenomenon, as an isolated phenomenon, sorry. There have been many mischaracterizations of a key concept of ecological psychology, which is ecological information. For example, Eric Min claimed that ecological information was semantic information, as it is understood by analytic philosophy and the like, but nothing further from the truth. If you are interested, Vicente Raja, Miguel Segundo, and I wrote a paper on the issue for philosophical psychology. But now I want to focus here on Di Paolo's claim that ecological psychology was mathematical information as it is understood in the Shannon-Weaver way. As he wrote, enactivists reject the notion that cognition is describable in terms of information processing. Ecological psychology does not reject the notion of information processing, which is the idea of the Shannon-Weaver approach to information. So, however, back in the 70s, in his magnum opus, the ecological approach to visual perception, Gibson made an effort to separate his kind of information from that kind of information, from that of Shannon-Weaver of information processing. Even he claimed that the term information, he claimed, was not the most suitable one, but he couldn't find another one that could suit better. He claimed that information for perception was different in kind from information for communication, which was the kind of information proposed by Shannon. As he wrote, the assumption that information can be transmitted and the assumption that it can be stored are appropriate for the theory of communication, not for the theory of perception. Shannon's concept of information applies to telephone hookups and radio broadcasting in elegant ways, but not, I think, to the first-hand perception of being in the world. The information for perception cannot be defined and measured as Claude Shannon's information can be. Also, Michaels and Palatinus defined very elegantly the idea of ecological information as a pattern of energy in space and time that specifies the state of affairs of the organism environment system. And there is, as in this view, as Gibson claims, there is it's not the kind of information that is transmitted over a channel. There is no sender outside the head and no receiver inside the head. So, also, ecological psychology reacts against some aspects of enaction as well. Take, for example, the idea of subjectivity, a key concept in enactivism. That emphasis on subjectivity comes in enaction comes from the focus on Merleau-Pontian phenomenology as the main philosophical antecedent of the enactive approach. For example, Ezequiel Di Paolo, Burman, and Barandiaran take subjectivity and first-person perspective as synonyms, and they claim that enaction aims to make sense of the subjective aspects of experience. On the contrary, ecological psychology accepts the idea of a first-person perspective as key for naturalizing perception and action and experience, but this approach does not equate a first-person perspective with subjectivity, because subjectivity is a heavily loaded concept that includes some problematic aspects. For example, accepting the idea of subjectivity implies a commitment with the subjective-objective dichotomy, something that emphasizes the gap between mind and world. When you use those concepts, you're rescuing those dichotomies that are not good for a situated and embodied approach. Ecological psychology rejects this gap between mind and world, and they propose to develop an approach to cognition that starts from the idea that organisms are already engaged with their environments. So the concept of affordance was offered to emphasize this idea, which helps to leave aside the old separation between subjectivity and objectivity, mind and world. As Gibson claimed, an affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective-objective and helps us to understand its inadequacy. It is equally a fact of the environment and a fact of behavior. Or, as he also claimed, the absolute duality of objective and subjective is false. When we consider the affordances of things, we escape this philosophical dichotomy. So in their paper, Fultot, Nier, and Carello claim that the enactive idea of sense-making and the emphasis on agency doesn't allow us to enjoy a complete picture that includes the environment. And it is because of the excessive emphasis on subjectivity that enaction places. As they claim, enactivists present us with a dichotomy where one has to choose between either a physicochemical description or a subjective perspectival description. But this ignores the possibility of a description of the ecosystem, though that could emphasize or illuminate those properties that highlight their mutuality, their co-determination, and their contribution to behavior. I personally consider that even when the criticism of Fultot, Nier, and Carello is a bit excessive against enactivism, I consider that a fully situated approach should go beyond the subjective-objective dichotomy and develop new concepts, such as the concept of affordance, as it was offered by ecological psychology, to avoid the conceptual pitfalls of these old, heavily loaded terms like subjectivity. Another example of these kind of problematic concepts, like subjectivity, that are present in the enactive approach is the concept of sensation. It is strange to see how sensations are equally specific, are equally invoked by cognitivism and enactivism as well. Sensations are defined, and I think no handbook would go against this definition, are defined as anatomically specific products of sensory receptors that correlate with physical energies in the environment. They occur in the organism, they are private and discrete, and they imply in their very definition a gap between the private side and the energies in the world, and a difference between the proximal stimulus and the distal stimulus. These are the sort of conceptual pitfalls that the idea of sensation implies. Something stranger to see is that enactivism reacts against cognitivism very fiercely, but at the same time, this approach neither rejects nor radically redefines the idea of sensation. Enactivists simply claim that sensations are related to action, should be understood properly when they are linked to action, but they buy the same neural or neurocentric approach to sensations that is present in the standard idea of sensations in every cognitive science or neurology handbook. For example, we can see it in the quotes. Varela, Thompson, and Roche talk about the sensory motor structure of the perceiver as the way the nervous system links sensory and motor surfaces. This is why, in my proposal, of combining ecological psychology and enaction, I claimed that enaction could focus on the subpersonal part of the story, because they explicitly claim that the sensory motor structure of the perceiver is the way the nervous system links sensory and motor surfaces. So the focus is on the way the nervous system works, and know how the organism environment system interact as a system, as a whole. What's the view of ecological psychology regarding the idea of sensation? As Harry Heft claimed in this paper, ecological psychology rejects the assumption that sensations play a role in perceiving. Instead, they are considered to be incidental to perceptual experience. Instead of a sensation-based account, ecological psychology offers an information-based account of perceiving. That is, ecological psychology, unlike enaction theory, dispenses with sensations in its account of perceiving. What is directly perceived is the environment. For this reason, the proximal-distal distinction found in most modern accounts of perception collapses. This was explicitly claimed since the very beginning, or since the very origins of ecological psychology, that perception is of ecological information, not of sensations. And again, including action in the picture and related action to sensation, I think it's not enough. It is better to reject sensation as the starting point of perception, because the idea of sensation as the impact of the impingement of some energies in the environment forces us to accept the dichotomies that are not consistent with embodiment and situatedness, such as the idea between proximal and distal stimuli, or the matching of sensations and their sources in the world to avoid epistemic gaps, and the gap that is proposed in the very idea of sensation between mind and world. So if enaction neither redefines the concept nor rejects it, I think it is better to focus on alternative theories that can make justice to the idea of situatedness, and that start from the very interaction and co-determination of organism and environment. So ecological psychology departs from the rejection of sensations and aims to build a new idea of cognition and nature and a new research programs for cognitive science. And this leads us, to Gallagher's idea that enaction is not a scientific research program, but a philosophy of nature. Both enaction and ecological psychology are naturalist and non-reductive approaches to the mind and approaches to nature. According to Gallagher, enactivism may be better thought of a philosophy of nature than a scientific research agenda, as philosophy of nature can use its own categories and concepts developed for the task of describing the world as accurately as possible when a range of scientific description are to be taken into account. This is the idea of a philosophy of nature as opposed to a scientific research program that Gallagher takes from Gottfried Smith. So, as Gallagher claims, even if enactivism were to be considered a philosophy of nature, it wouldn't be right to conclude that it cannot offer concrete hypotheses or raise novel scientific questions, or, as it is supposed to do more often, reinterpreting data or evidence gathered by other research programs. But I think this idea of reinterpreting evidence from other research programs is quite problematic, because a full-blown cognitive science that aims to outcompete cognitivism cannot just simply reinterpret evidence gathered by cognitivism or by any other ism. It should offer new evidence and develop a scientific framework that focuses on the aspects that it finds of value. For this reason, I think that ecological psychology is both a philosophy of nature and a research program. It proposes a new ontology of nature of its own, one that starts from the active agent as an explorer that directly perceives affordances thanks to her movement, as that explorer is constantly engaging with the world. It starts from the organism environment unit of analysis. This new ontology of mind and nature can be found in the definition of the active agent as the starting point of cognition, the idea of environment as composed of substances, surfaces, and the medium, or the proposal of a new ontology of perception with the idea of affordance, that, let's remember, affordances go beyond the subjective-objective dichotomy and start from the very core determination of organism and environment. Also, ecological psychology offers a research program with its own models and metrics. And this is highly important because the scientific program that is being built since many decades ago aims to illuminate processes and aspects that are largely overlooked by previous cognitivist programs. Take, for example, the experimental analysis of the affordance of climbability developed by Warren back in 1984. Warren aimed to analyze the affordance of climbability from an ecological approach. He did this by studying how people raise their legs to step on different obstacles or steps. As it is expected, tall people can step on higher steps than short people. But he asked himself, what's behind every participant's estimation that a step is climbable? So he aimed to study every participant's estimation about the climbability of a step by analyzing the relation between the participant's leg length and the height of the step. He started from that very relation. So he started from that relation between the organism and the environment and proposed a simple biomechanical model that captures this idea of organism-environment reciprocity. According to the evidence gathered by developing a fully ecological model, an agent with two fully functional legs will perceive as climbable a step that is the 88% of the length of her leg. So what we see here is that there's a new model for scientifically explain affordances with agent-related metrics, not with neutral metrics. There's an ecological science working here to make sense of these objects of perception that were not defined as such by cognitivism. So this is how Warren proposed the use of agent-related metrics for describing the affordance of climbability from an ecological approach. And Warren's experiment was somehow the starting point for some studies that make the concept of affordance truly operative in experimental terms. So the example of climbability is quite useful for illustrating why affordances are aspects of the environment that are related to the capacities of the organism that perceive them. The key aspect is in the very idea of using a metric and a model that is relative to the size of the leg of each particular agent. In this sense, it is a body scale metric, not a neutral metric in centimeters or inches. This is an example of why we do not just need a new philosophy of nature that reinterprets data or evidence collected by other research programs. We need a research program of our own to scientifically describe the world in the way we think it's more accurate. Reinterpreting data, again, is not enough. We need our own scientific tools to describe the aspects of the world, or the aspects of nature that have been largely overlooked by other research programs.
Sorry, Manuel, if I could just ask you to run quick to the end. I'm just watching time for discussion, if that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure, that's the last slide. So after providing a general view of the similarities and differences of ecological psychology and enaction, one comes with the conclusion that there are complementarities, similarities, but also points of digression and divergence between both approaches. I think that a full-blown non-cognitivist approach demands new conceptual foundations, but also demands a new research program. A new conception of nature and cognition demands new research tools to make justice to the goals and commitments of this new way of understanding mind and nature, and also to aspects of analysis that have been largely overlooked by other research programs. So against Gallagher, reinterpreting data is not enough. We should generate new data. For example, offering empirical data on the perception of affordances, creating new models and metrics, and a cognitive science from an embodied, situated, and non-representational framework. And in conclusion, from my humble point of view, I think ecological psychology seems to be in a better position to achieve this goal of building a non-cognitivist, post-cognitivist, or furry cognitive science that outcompetes cognitivism. And that's it. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Manuel, for that. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'm keeping an eye on the chat on YouTube just to see if questions appear there. I'll relay them in. But we have a couple of people live with us. So if I will, if I may ask you, Manuel, if you close the screen share there, and I'll just check first whether either Nat or Mark have questions that we might relay.
Yeah, how long do we have for questions, Mark?
We've got at least the 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more. But my Zoom account is required for school, so I have to move off with more alacrity than I often would.
Okay, well, maybe I'll start. I had a few questions, and some I'm afraid that it might be too long to get into, but maybe I'll just, a quick question. Thanks for that, Manuel, sorry. A quick question just towards the end of the talk where you were introducing, I suppose, ecological psychology as both a philosophy of nature and scientific enterprise. But so one thing you talked about is the climbability, and I think this gets to a deeper concern of mine, but the climbability, and you talked about 80%, you're saying that there's a ratio in the relationship between the leg and the steps, and if that's present, the affordance is just perceived because I'm directly perceiving the affordance in the environment, giving my capacities or whatever. But my sense is here, right, okay, well, there could be this perfect ratio, but given the history of the person interacting and now present to the step, it doesn't show up as an affordance, right? It just shows up as, for instance, if somebody had some sort of trauma, right, and they slipped on a step the week previously, they might acknowledge that there was once upon a time a possibility to climb this step, but now presently there isn't, and the affordance is not there. And I think that gets to a larger point. That is, I think what enaction centers is really this notion of historicity in a way, right? When the environment shows up for us, it shows up in relationship to our history of interacting with the environment. And that's enshrined in something like, for instance, in a sensory motor count, in an identity that one seeks to maintain. You know, they see the environment in a certain way because they seek to maintain a certain kind of identity, and therefore they're engaged with certain affordances of the environment. So yeah, I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Thanks for the question, Mark. There's something that you said that is, when a person has a trauma, for example, the affordance that you said, the affordance is just not there. But the point of ecological psychology is that the affordance is there. It's just the agent has a trauma and cannot take the affordance, or cannot, there's some kind of problem in the taking of the affordance. But the point of the affordances, of what this study shows, is that the affordance depends on, is a relation between the height of the step and the height of your leg. And then if you don't take the affordance, or you're not sensitive to that affordance, that is related to aspects related to, I don't know, emotions or other psychological traumas, as you said, or whatever. But the point is that the relation is constant between the leg and the height. So it is possible to do it. It's right there for you to take it. But if you don't take it because you have a trauma, you have to, okay, that's a special clinical case that we all have to take into account. But it's not the thing that we are enclosed in our own way of seeing the world. We are constantly interacting with the world. We have different aspects of our history of interactions that create different dispositions in us. But the point is that the trauma is something different from the affordance itself. It's a constant relation between dimensions of your body and aspects of the environment. And if you have a trauma and you cannot take that affordance, we have to see why. But you are capable to do so because the dimensions of your body and the environment fit, and you can do it. Of course, there are different layers in the history of interactions of every agent. And that part is the layer of perception and action, or understood in a biomechanical way and the like. And we should add more layers and see how they are connected to each one. And there should be also the emotional layer and the social layer and the like. But we should proceed, as I see it, step by step, to see the full picture and the connections, and not just a great entanglement in which everything is connected, which it is, but we have to see the specific contribution of each aspect of cognition and each layer. I don't know if that answered your questions.
I guess I kind of... I kind of expect.
This is a quick rejoinder, Mark. That'll be okay. I want to give Nat and others a chance as well. Is this a quick comment or?
No, please go ahead. If it's probably not a quick comment.
Nat, did you have something you wanted to say there? You look like you were aiming to jump in, or?
Well, I'll just take the opportunity since I'm one of the 2 live audience members here. I really enjoyed the talk. It's a difficult thing to articulate convergences and tensions because they're constantly changing. These are programs evolving rapidly, and enactivism 2.0 or 3.0 is going to have different relationship. I think sometimes there's a lot of cross-pollination going on now. And so for the work by DiPaolo, Berman, and Briandran that you cited has excellent analysis of sensory motor contingencies and breaking it down into levels, which in some ways for me is one of the best ways of trying to understand what an affordance is, because they sort of work out like bare possibilities, and then they move in towards the agent perspective. It's really well done. I just wanted to sort of, if I have a comment about an issue that's important to both programs that's in progress, is this idea of affordance. The way you were describing it, it's sort of like it's a bare possibility, like something that the agent or the organism can do. But part of the original idea, but still that needs to be articulated better, is that there's also something of a kind of an invitation character to an affordance. It's not just a bare possibility. There's also a kind of an attraction to the agent, or the opposite, a repulsion. There are things that invite affordances that invite actions, and others that don't, and that depends upon a lot of different things like the state of the agent and so forth. But that sort of motivational or affective character of affordances is something registered in the ecological perspective, and it's something that some of them talk about. Reid talked about the seeking after value and meaning and so forth, but this fundamentally motivated character of cognition is something that interests me in particular, and I try to track it in both programs, and both programs have ways of getting at that. I'm not sure that either has a complete sort of a theory, but I would really say that that's an important sort of desideratum for both approaches, is to try to figure out that aspect. And what are your comments on that, maybe?
Well, as you say, Nathaniel, I didn't stress very much the idea of affordance in the way that you have stressed it. It was a matter of lack of time and space. But yeah, as you say, Gibson himself said that there were positive and negative affordances, possibilities that that preclude you to take them, and other possibilities that invite you to take them. And yes, in many in different texts, Gibson claimed that he came with the idea of affordance as a substitute for the idea of value. But the point is that the idea of value is not a projection of the organism from within to the environment, but the value is already in the organism-environment interaction, is constituted by that organism-environment mutuality. So of course, that was the main point of divergence of ecological psychology and Gestalt when Gibson met Kafka and he engaged into the study of Gestalt psychology. He rejected the emphasis on subjectivity of the Gestaltists, but took the idea that what we perceive are values, and the affordances are a substitute for values, understood in this very special way that emerged these values emerge from the interaction of organism and environment. That, of course, that's the idea of meaning and the like in ecological psychology.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. So there is actually a rather lively discussion on the YouTube channel, but there aren't any specific comments or queries coming up that maybe I think I could confidently relay. Mark, you said you had another. I mean, I've half a dozen questions myself, but I might, Mark, give you a chance to come back in.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Maybe I can represent my former supervisor Fred Cummins here and make an inquiry. Maybe he's in the chat, and if he is, maybe he can correct me. But I think I'm representing him fairly. So, in the recent issue that you edited and put together, Fred suggests that he kind of picks up this line of the philosophy of nature also a little bit, and suggests that what enactivism is really pointing towards is this idea that our knowledge is always framed, right? And it's always framed by this history of engagement with the world. And even something like ecological psychology, we're engaged in this practice of doing a particular scientific enterprise, but we have to acknowledge that any objectivity that arises therein is still framed by us being in a particular domain of discourse and agreeing on certain assumptions, and that the enactive kind of vocabulary gives us a better vocabulary to acknowledge that as a starting point, right? So Fred says, okay, what enaction is doing is setting a set of epistemic limits, right? It's saying, okay, because you are an organism engaged with a particular world, the world is going to show up for you in a particular way. So, this is one of the starting points. And for me, maybe the more interesting starting point of enaction is that it really emphasizes this notion of dependent co-arising, right? It has some roots in Buddhism and so on. And if we acknowledge that as our epistemic starting point, and we then go on to do science, well, we can do something like ecological psychology, and that's a healthy science. It's a healthy scientific enterprise, and we can make fine distinctions and so on therein. But we also have to say, yes, but it's an objectivity that's framed by, this, agreement on this kind of consensus of this is where we're starting, and the limits of our knowledge has been set already by the fact that we are these organisms of a particular sort with a particular history and so on. So in that way, I think the convergence is this kind of it's a different type of relation, right? We're not trying to get this perfectly integrated, systematic system that combines enaction and ecological psychology, but that in a sense, right, if you occupy one and then you occupy the other, from any point of view, you might have some sort of conceptual set of concepts that allow me to see what you're talking about, right? I can see what you're talking about in ecological psychology from my point of view of enaction. And you, within ecological psychology, it's sufficiently well developed that you can kind of see what I'm talking about within enaction, but they're never going to kind of converge in some sort of systematic way. And maybe a better way to hold the relationship between the two of them is to say, okay, enaction sets this epistemic limit. We're always having this conversation. And if we're talking about objectivity, it's objectivity in brackets. And now let's go and do some science in an ecological kind of vein, but let's acknowledge our epistemic limits as we do it. And then just carry some humility into the practice.
Yeah, I see that the main problem of the 4E approach or the post-cognitivist approach is the lack of a single unified vocabulary, but also the lack of a single unified research program or even methodology. And I think that undermines the potential of the 4E approach in general. First of all, I would say that I would take out the extended mind hypothesis from the 4E approach because it's too oriented to cognitivism. And when I see the 4E approach or post-cognitivism or non-cognitivism, I focus on enaction and ecological psychology. I think that the main difference between the two approaches regarding this issue of the lack of a conceptual repertoire that is shared by both views is that, and also the different ways of understanding scientific research. I think that that has consequences for the trajectories of both theories. For example, enaction goes from perception and rapidly, in a very quick way, goes from perception and action to social interaction to existentialism even, art, I don't know, a wide range of topics, jump from one another. Whereas ecological psychology just goes step by step, like, okay, we just discovered a new way of making sense of perception and action. We have to develop a research program. We will start doing hard science. And then they spend the last 50 years doing hard science of in vivo experimental, of gathering in vivo experimental evidence. And I think that is kind of a complementarity, because enaction could be like the ranger that goes in the first that goes first into a new unexplored areas, and then the whole army comes after the ranger to conquer that field. But the point is, what I see is that, as strange as it may sound, ecological psychology developed a fully non-cognitivist research program with its own way of doing science, with models, metrics, and the like. What I don't understand is why I open a book of about enactivism, and they talk about a lot of experiments, like, for example, Libet's experiments and the like, but they do not mention, they constantly mention the idea of affordance, but they do not mention these experiments by Warren or Fagen or Jacobs, Travieso, and the like. And to me, it's really frustrating, because it's like, hey, you have a full-blown, situated and embodied research program doing the kind of science that you like, and you mention the concepts, but you do not mention the experiments. And that could be a new way of building bridges and complementarities between enaction and ecological psychology. If enactivists start talking about these experiments. And I think that there are many points of complementarity, there are many points of convergence, of divergence, but also many points of misunderstanding. And I think it's our task as philosophers to offer a conceptual clarification of all these aspects, and try to, with the aim of unify the vocabulary between these two approaches, and try to finally develop a full-blown non-cognitivist cognitive science, I think.
Thanks very much. Actually, that seems like a wonderfully rounded and encompassing thought with which to finish the seminar. So I'm gutted to be cutting it off. Actually, there's a number of questions that started coming in on YouTube. Manuel, I would invite you to actually have a look at, so people are all obviously very complimentary, and there's a lot of applause there too, which I can't, unfortunately. I'm gonna have to get a soundboard and just have a sort of cheering stadium noise or something that we can add as we go through. But there would certainly seem to be a substantial appetite for this discussion. And I would invite people to go to the encelseminars.com webpage On the page for Manuel's talk, there is a discussion forum there embedded, and I would certainly encourage anyone interested in continuing the discussion to move to that forum, and the conversation can continue there. Unfortunately, I have to bring things to a close, but I am very grateful, Manuel, for your presentation and for the discussion, to Nat and Mark as well for participating, and to everyone who's been making comments through the YouTube chat as well. And all that remains is to say that our next ENSO seminar will actually be coming in a relatively short period of time. We will be back to our regular, we've a gentle start to the year, but we're back to our regular first Thursday of the month slot come February, where Nick Brancazio will be presenting. And so that will be in just about 2 weeks' time, or a little bit more than 2 weeks' time. So very looking forward to that. So thanks again very much, Manuel, and
For the invitation.
we'll see everyone else soon for the next ENSO seminar.
Thanks.
See you guys.